A fantasy book with a made-up world and made-up characters can feature an extremely patriarchal society and still not be a problematic book to read. This is a claim that seems to be more and more debatable over time, as there are an increasing amount of readers who are wanting positive representation in every single book. And while I do love positive representation and I love a strong character that is able to overcome all odds and get ahead, I still have a place in my own personal heart for books that don't end well and for situations that are not easily overcome. Some readers right now only want books that include sexist characters or frameworks if those are things that are ultimately overcome. Basically, there needs to be a character that is capable and is capable enough to overcome everything put in their way. I don't feel this way. I think it is okay to have a story where things don't end up the way we want them to end up. In some cases, the inclusion of a character that people don't like and that does not have good views is affecting the star ratings of books. I still think that there is a difference between a book that is problematic in itself and a book that includes problematic themes throughout the story, and I hope that we still are in a situation where we can have this nuanced conversation. I consider myself a feminist, and I know that there are so many women who have fought for so many things that have allowed me to have the life that I have right now. In addition, I know that the problem that women face in society is not already solved. In fact, some people hear a feminine voice on a YouTube video and immediately disregard everything she is saying. I've had some comments like that already, and also as a former teacher, there are some male students that cannot be disciplined by a female teacher. So I want you to know that in this discussion, I'm not coming at it from the perspective of internalized misogyny, where I think all women all the time are overreacting, but rather I'm coming at this discussion as a defense of art, because I still think that there is something to be gained from books that feature these patriarchal societies that are being oftentimes misunderstood. Not every book has to be an egalitarian utopia where everyone is treated the way we want them to be treated. In fact, doing so can be problematic because not only does it gloss over real human experience, but it also treats adults like children. It's fantasy, not reality. There is a common claim that fantasy is fantasy. It's not historical fiction. It's not literary fiction. It is an author going into their brain, creating with their imagination a new world that can be however they want it to be. So for some readers, it's problematic when the world that the author chooses to create is one that is misogynistic. From their perspective, the author chose this of their own free will and could have written it in any way. To be fair to people who've made this argument that I have seen, they do seem to be consistent with their argument. The idea is that a historical fiction book can include some undesirable things because it's depicting history, and a literary fiction book sometimes can too because they see that genre as being closer to depicting the human experience. But they have a hard time with fantasy books depicting that because they look at fantasy in a way of it being escapist fiction that people read for fun, and because of that, fantasy should be something that is treated differently than other genres. One series that I talked about earlier this year is the First Law trilogy. I personally enjoyed this book. This book is definitely very patriarchal, and the women in this book do not have happy endings, and they are not put in the best positions, and basically, they're not able to overcome those poor positions that they are put in, and to some extent, you can even see some women within the series being treated like pawns. That's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. The women that were included in the book did feel compelling to me. I enjoyed their characters. That being said, in this series, I definitely could have seen more of them. It was definitely very limited, but I didn't find this book problematic because of the patriarchal system that it used. We aren't going to focus on that book, though. Jay Kristoff is an author that has had a lot of controversy. And going into this as someone who doesn't keep up with book drama very much, I just want to say that I think it's okay for people not to have an opinion on every piece of drama. And I could not make up my mind as to if any of the allegations against him were true or false. I know Jay Kristoff has been accused of including some things in his books that people do not like. For example, in one of his books that I did not read, I think he uses a character name that some people found offensive. And then in another book that I didn't read, I believe some people accused him of cultural appropriation because he was writing a book that was heavily based on Asian culture. I don't have the details, nor do I have an opinion on those. The only books I've ever read from Jay Kristoff are the books in the Illuminae series, which is a YA series that I don't think has any drama surrounding it, and The Empire of the Vampire, which does have some drama surrounding it, and we're going to focus on that book because that is a grimdark fantasy book with a patriarchal world, and it's the one that fits this video. But as a quick comment on the Jay Kristoff thing, I think we should avoid putting any author on a pedestal. I think a lot of us were shocked when the Neil Gaiman stuff came to life. So I think that we should just be careful in idolizing anyone ever. That being said, we're going to focus on the actual book and we're not going to focus on the author. The Empire of the Vampire is a grimdark fantasy book that follows Gabriel de Leon, who is a silver saint. A silver saint is a human man who is half vampire. In the world, this is seen as a bad thing. However, he gets to sort of redeem himself and still be sort of an honorable person by choosing to be a silver saint to fight the vampires. The vampires in this world are extremely bad. They kill lots of people and it is very gory. Not your Twilight vampires. Gabriel de Leon has to join a brotherhood, which is basically in this like cult-like commune, and learn how to fight the vampires. This is a patriarchal society for sure. The women in this world are not treated well, and they do not overcome the problems of the world by the end of the book. In fact, a lot of critics of this book will say that it's problematic that some of the prominent female characters don't even survive the books. That is sort of the opposite of fixing and overcoming a problematic and fallen world. The top reviewer on Goodreads wants to hold Jay Kristoff accountable. She calls him out for being misogynistic based off of what he wrote in The Empire of the Vampire. Let me play her clip.
So the first and most blatant issue for me with this book is the misogyny. I noticed it immediately. I noticed it pretty quickly right off the bat.
Pay attention to her next point.
And at a certain point in the beginning, like toward the beginning, I realized it wasn't going to change. Like at no point were we going to move past that or grow from it. That's just how the book is written. And so I started tabbing it. Roughly a little over 100 pages in, I started tabbing the misogyny in this book.
You'll see that she's saying exactly what I mentioned earlier, that a patriarchal society in a book is only allowed if it is overcome. In her review, she says, I could tell that a lot of the dialogue was misogynistic and a lot of people in this world were not treating women well or using respectful language towards women, and it never gets better. Meaning that if it did get better, it would be okay, but since it never gets better, it's a problematic book in her opinion. Plenty of people agreed with her in the comments, and this is definitely an opinion that is held by a lot of women, and I understand where they're coming from, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But there were people who disagreed with her as well. Here was a comment thread with a girl named Anna. She says, "My girl, the context of the story, the place and time where it happens." And the Goodreads reviewer says, "Oh man, you're totally right. We have to take into account the historical accuracy. Unrelated, point me to the vampires in a history textbook." So what I'm hearing is that you can suspend your disbelief for vampires, but treating women like people is a step too far outside of the norm. And Anna says, "Girl, they don't even have electricity and use horses. Yeah, it's a fictional world inspired by some real historical times with that historical context." The belief that seems to be coming from this conversation is as soon as you take any artistic liberties with a book, like including vampires, then you should make sure that the book is egalitarian to some extent or treats women well. And I think that is a little strange. The claim is that since the book is not strictly historical fiction, and because it includes fantastical or supernatural elements, that the author is just choosing to be misogynistic. But let's just think about that for a second. The Empire of the Vampire is clearly based on medieval Europe. When you read how people act in villages and the dynamics between different professions and people within it, it's very clear to me, especially when you have like that brotherhood of religious silver saints. That is very, very medieval. And it is very true that a lot of those brotherhood cult-like things were very masculine, and it was a form of masculinity in Europe. In fact, I just read Summer of Fire and Blood, which is on the German Peasants' War, and the idea of brotherhood was very, very strong within that historical context. And I'm not saying that this fantasy world is 100% based on any particular European country, but it does have a lot of the same themes, and it definitely has the same feeling. So the question is, if you are sort of putting a fantasy world over the context of something that feels historical and feels like it has time and place, why would you remove the sexism if that is inherently part of the setting that you're choosing to place your story in, especially considering the fact that it's a grimdark story that isn't supposed to have a happy ending? Not allowing people to sort of mesh two genres together doesn't enhance what can be done with fantasy, it restricts it. So I want to add in a clip because I think this woman has a point worth talking about. Let me go ahead and play it.
What always gets me about these extremely misogynistic pseudo-medieval fantasy worlds is that the people who write and defend them don't seem to actually know anything about the Middle Ages. They're not interested in doing actual research. They're not reading peer-reviewed books and articles by historians talking about gender in the Middle Ages.
Okay, this is an ultra video inception. I will just say I did misgender them. I'm sorry about that. That was an honest mistake. I do actually want us to engage with the argument that they are presenting. This is tough because in many ways I think she is partially right. Not everyone who creates a fantasy world does a lot of deep dive research into history, and they do kind of base their world based off of ideas in their head. Sometimes people do good research, and I respect that. Sorry if you hear the dog drinking water. That being said, I feel like this kind of applies to all sides of this debate to some extent, because you are going to want to cherry pick things out of history that support your position. I have a history degree and I did not focus many of my studies on Europe, so straight out about that. What I did learn was there were tons of terrible things that happened to women and a lot of women who were mistreated. Does every medieval feeling fantasy book depict that perfectly or depict it accurately? Probably not. That gets back into that discussion of how close does something have to be? Does historical fiction or historical fantasy have to have elements that are extremely accurate in order for the dynamics that the author shows in their world to be useful? I don't know if I have a clear answer to that completely, so that's something that you can talk about in the comments as well. And here's the thing, if you want vampires and gender equality, there are so many books out there for you. Read one that's like that and choose to read ones that are like that. They are everywhere on the market. If you want to find strong women with vampires, I can give you 20 different titles. Being upset that one book took a different direction because you personally don't like that direction, I think can be a little bit unfair. A compelling female character. There is an interesting character in this book, and I want to talk about her a little bit because for me, this is the crux of the whole argument. There is a woman who is like a noble woman who is being forced to become a nun within the Empire of the Vampire. Her name is Astrid. She does not overcome the patriarchy, and she does not change the world. However, she is still a compelling character, in my opinion. Astrid reads forbidden books in the library at night because she's not allowed to read them during the day. She also acquires different substances that she personally wants to enjoy, even though they aren't strictly allowed. A lot of these little rebellions humanize her, and show that even though she can't overcome the system she's within, she is still trying to make moves to have a little bit more power, control, and meaning in her life and have it be closer to the one she wants to live. To me, it's giving Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was a Mexican nun that was a nun in the late 1600s, and she chose to become a nun because she wanted the freedom to be able to read and write and not be, a servant to her husband. So she ends up writing a lot of feminist poetry and making quite an impact on the people directly around her. You can still read a lot of what she published today. Sor Juana was told to stop everything she was doing by the Catholic Church. They were upset with the direction that some of her writings were taking and with the impact she was beginning to have. In 1694, she succumbed to this pressure, put down her pen, sold all of her books to help charity, and dedicated her remaining years to charity, mainly through things like nursing people who were sick. She was a strong, capable, and spunky woman who ultimately in her lifetime could not overcome the patriarchal society that she lived within and eventually caved to the pressure, living her last few years quietly. I really don't think Astrid from Empire of the Vampire was inspired by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Their lives are definitely different enough to be very distinct. That being said, I made the connection in my head because I think that there's something to be said about it. Just as Sor Juana never overcame the patriarchy, sometimes it's nice to have a woman in a fantasy world that is really tough to navigate, not be able to handle it either, because it sort of puts a mirror up to humanity and lets us consider how hard it has been for some people and how some people really act and how we can be as humans when we are not at our best. In a strange way, it's hard for me to describe what I feel when I read stories that don't end well because to me it can be partially comforting, but I think part of the comfort for me is just in a way the representation of these women of history who were not able to make everything better by seeing fictional women in fantasy stories that are also not able to make everything better. It shows us that some situations really are hard and that things can be very complex and that not everything, no matter how capable or perfect we are, is something that can be overcome. By making it hard for the characters in these books, it is easier to contemplate humanity and form our opinions on power structures and how they are set up. Even with all of what I just said, a book like this can still be damaging to you, and that's okay. It's not what you need. In a previous video, I brought up content warnings or trigger warnings, and we had a little bit of a debate in the comments about that topic. In the content warning video, some people made the argument that content warnings are not ideal in their opinion because books are the best way to have to look at harsh situations and deal with things. Other people said that they're not always in the headspace to be able to handle every type of book, and sometimes they just need to skip something for now because they can't handle it, at least at the moment. And the phrase, they can't handle it, is not very generous. I kind of more mean that it's not what they need right now. I think this could legitimately be the case for a lot of women when it comes to books that feature deeply patriarchal worlds that don't always treat women well. That's not always what women need to read. When I have gone through harsh periods in my life where things were tough, I found myself reading a lot of romance books or even really inspiring self-help books. I know that there's a huge anti-self-help book crowd, but sometimes you just need to be told that you can do it and get a little bit of motivation, and I've definitely had periods of my life like that for sure. I also had one period of my reading life where I just read Ruby Dixon books back to back to back, which is a little embarrassing, but at that moment, that's probably what I needed. I am so glad that there are a lot of books that are available for women to read that feature powerful women who do overcome the odds, and I want those books to continue to find their audience. Sometimes when you are personally struggling with a lot of things in your life, especially if you are personally struggling with some form of sexism in your own life, you don't need to read these type of books. Not everyone at all times will benefit from a patriarchal, grimdark fantasy book where things don't end well. Sometimes that's not what you need. That doesn't mean that these books shouldn't exist and they don't offer value to some people. Some people derive benefits from seeing situations that don't pan out and from evaluating social structures that are found within fantasy books. Fantasy books are a great way to experiment with different ideas and show different sides of humanity in a world that feels distinct enough from our own to offer a little bit of a fresh perspective with a little bit of a twist. Some people need that small barrier between fantasy and reality to actually have the confidence to examine reality, and I just want to defend that. Books can still be sexist. Books can still be problematic and sexist. I don't want to say they can. I'm not dismissing that books can legitimately be problematic and can legitimately have very poor writing because of bad depiction of female characters. In fact, the other day I was reading a fantasy book that I don't want to name because I don't like bringing negativity up all the time, where this man wrote this woman into the story that basically just existed to ask her husband questions that he would give answers that were like this long to, and then she would tell him how smart he was and how perfect he was. It was basically the author wrote his male main character a perfect, idyllic, quiet wife that never really did anything. She deeply loved him like a puppy and never had any original thoughts. And if you are a man watching this and you have a girlfriend or a wife, you'll know that that is not the most accurate depiction of women, nor should it be. So yes, there can be books that have terrible execution of female characters, and there has been a problem with that. Especially in the past. I think that there's not as much of a market for it now than there used to be, and a lot of books are starting to have a much better representation of female characters, in my opinion, but that stuff does still exist. Something that's interesting about those books, though, is sure, we can call them sexist because they are, but I also think a lot of those books tend to be poorly written because the characters are so poorly fleshed out. So sure, you can call it problematic because it's sort of a misogynist way of writing, but you can also just call it a poorly written book, because if you don't write your characters to actually act like real people, your book is just not going to be good anyway. I think it's definitely still worth distinguishing between a book that has a patriarchal world that is not easy to overcome, where women within the story are still compelling, and a book where women are so poorly written that the book isn't even good. Those are not the same thing. There are people who can get a lot of value from the first one. The second one, I'm sure there's fans for these type of books, but you can probably call these ones a little bit more misogynistic in their writing without being wrong. One more thing I do want to talk about, though, before we get to some of our final thoughts, is that adults aren't children. Most of these books that get criticized online are written for adults. And I have this idea in my head that readers on average might have better media literacy, meaning that they're able to critically think when they consume some sort of piece of art more so than the average TV watcher or movie watcher. But I also acknowledge that I might be 100% wrong on that. So I sometimes give readers the benefit of the doubt because I feel like they have the ability to read a book that includes a very patriarchal world, but not necessarily be like, oh, that's how the world should be, but rather examine humanity through the lens of that world. I feel like a lot of people have the capability to do that. I could be wrong, though. Maybe readers don't think critically, and everything that they consume just becomes what they want the world to be. Like, you consume Empire the Vampire, and then you start calling women certain names that I can't say on YouTube. Even if that's true, I don't think the solution is fewer challenging books. The solution should be better media literacy. The solution should be creating a culture where we can debate things and talk about things and get into passages and go from the book culture we have, which is holding up books and saying what we love about them without nuance, to being able to talk about specific things in order to analyze books. Once we go down the path of not culturally allowing certain things in fiction, I'm afraid of where that path could lead us. And I know that's very much of a slippery slope argument. I just don't want us to start saying that everyone in every book has to act well, because then we have a lot less to examine in our books and a lot less to talk about. Even if some readers do lack critical thinking skills, and even if some readers do lack media literacy, I still hope that we go towards the direction of freedom of speech so that we can have different books that provide different artistic benefits come to market. And let's just be honest, we're not in 1985 anymore. There's plenty of fantasy books that will appeal to women who don't want to read these dark stories. There's plenty of romantasy books. There's plenty of general epic fantasy books with really strong female characters. And I feel like we're getting to the point where there's a lot better representation. I know that I've seen so many comments on some of my videos from some women who are a little bit older who talk of a time where they couldn't see themselves in anything. And I do think a little bit of representation matters. I think being able to see yourself in stories matters. I do think that having diversity in what is on the shelves matters. I just think the existence of some dark books that don't end well is okay, especially when they are alongside a bunch of positive books that do end well. I also want to push back on the idea that every single book should explicitly examine morality. I think it's okay for a book to just show a situation and then you as the reader examine the morality within the book. I don't think every book should have to have the lesson attached explicitly in the writing, but is something that you can extract as the reader. And of course, that does require some critical thinking skills, and it does require us to slow down and really think about our books. But I do think that that is still worth it. Adults can and should be expected to be able to form their own opinions about the worlds they read about without having to make sure they put every single book down that ever has anything problematic show up. My final thoughts. I do understand the concept of wanting positive representation in books and wanting to have the world a certain way. And I think some of those idyllic books can be very powerful because they empower real life people, and I want them to continue existing. In fact, I spend a lot of time defending books that women love that get attacked on the internet for that very reason. As someone who gets value from books that depict a lot of depressing realism, or even sometimes worse than realism, I just want to defend those books too because I do think they have a place. I think that it is so true that there are situations that can't be overcome. There are times when you might do everything right, or a character might do everything right, and you might be rooting for the character, but life is really just too hard. And while that is not optimistic and that is not going to make a lot of people feel good, it is something that brings comfort to me in a weird way, because I think it gives a lot of representation to parts of the human condition that I really enjoy examining and contemplating. Women who are compelling but don't overcome the challenges of their world give some sort of representation to women in the real world that couldn't overcome the challenges of ours. I also think it's a good moment to recognize that not everyone gets the same thing out of books, and that's okay. Let me know what you think of this down in the comments. I know it's definitely a little bit controversial and people will have different opinions, and that's okay. I'd be totally willing to do a follow-up video to this one where I examine other people's ideas, because my ideas, believe it or not, are not the end of the discussion.